On Monday, Katie felt happy as she and Obi walked to the bus stop. She knew she had been good in the city yesterday. Very, very good. Maybe Santa had noticed. She'd seen him on the street corner ringing a little bell. Obi, Katie said to him. She swung her backpack around in front of her. You know about Santa? What about him? Obi said. Well, you're supposed to be good, she said. Right? I am good, Obi said. I know, Katie said. But does he come to everybody, you think? Yeah, Obi said. Bad people, too? Katie said. Really bad? Obi said. Well, maybe sort of bad, Katie said. Oh, Obi said. He was quiet a minute. Then he said, I don't think so. Not to everybody. Katie frowned. That's what I think, she said. And he should. He really, really should. I'm going to write and tell him. Don't say anything mean, Obi said. I won't. Katie said. When they got to school, Katie was still thinking. A letter. A Santa letter. She wondered if he would answer if she wrote to him. She wondered if he would listen to what she said, that maybe some people couldn't help being bad. She put away her coat, then went over and looked in on the rabbits in their cage. The class gerbils had run away, and now they had 2 pet rabbits. The class had named them Ken and Barbie. Katie wondered if the rabbits had been caught in a rabbit trap or something. Katie turned so that her back was to the room and no one could see. Then she slid the bar out of the little metal ring and quietly opened the cage. She knew she was supposed to ask permission first, but Mrs. Henry, their teacher, was busy counting lunch slips. Besides, Katie knew she'd be careful. Very carefully, she lifted Ken out. He was all white and fluffy and soft. She held him up against her face. She could feel his little heart beating fast against her hand. It felt like a little motor or something. He nibbled at her neck. It tickled. Hey, Ken, Katie said. Do you like it here? He made little snuffly sounds. All right, boys and girls, Mrs. Henry said then. I want you all to get to your seats, sit up straight and tall, and listen. Quickly, Katie slid Ken back into his cage. Bye, Ken, she said to him. She closed the cage door and slid the bar across it. The bar was supposed to slide into a little metal ring. But the bar stuck. It wouldn't go all the way in the ring. She wiggled it a little. It was still stuck. We're waiting, Katie, Mrs. Henry said. Katie wiggled the bar once more. The bar still wasn't all the way inside the ring, but almost. It looked tight enough. Katie hurried to her seat. She sat up on her knees, though, so she could still see Ken and Barbie. Everybody in class was sitting up straight and tall. Emil Marks stuck his shoulders back like he was in the army. Katie had never seen Emil do that before. Actually, she had never seen him sit still before. She wondered how long he could stay like that. Everybody ready? Mrs. Henry said. She was looking at Katie. Katie unfolded her legs. She sat up straight and tall. One side, her friend next to Katie on one Amelia sat up straight, too. On the other side of Katie, Tiffany sat up straight. Her hands were folded on her desk, and her hair was brushed straight back into a ponytail. Even the pencils on her desk were straight. Her back was the straightest of all. Everything about Tiffany was perfect. Except that she was the meanest girl in the class. Perfectly mean. Katie tried to sit as straight as Tiffany. It made her back hurt. Ouch, she said. Katie, are you listening? Mrs. Henry. Katie felt her ears get hot. She nodded. Said. All right then, boys and girls, Mrs. Henry said. This is what we are going to do today. She held up a little box. In it were folded scraps of paper. These are your names in here, Mrs. Henry said. Each person's name is on a slip of paper. I'm going to go up and down the aisle and each of you is to take out a piece of paper name. Just take it, but don't look at it yet. Why not? Emil called out. He didn't raise his hand. Mrs. Henry looked at Emil. She did her wide-eyed look. Emil raised his hand. He was always forgetting to do that. Yes, Emil. Mrs. Henry said in her I want to be friends voice. Why can't we look? Emil said. You'll see in a minute, Mrs. Henry said. This is about being a secret Santa. And you know what a secret Santa does? What? Emil said. Mrs. Henry smiled. Each day next week, you bring in a present for the person whose name you get, she said. And each day you'll get a present because somebody has your name. But it's a secret. You can't tell whose name you have. You'll be a secret Santa. There is no Santa, Tiffany muttered. Mrs. Henry didn't hear, but Katie did. Katie made a witch face at Tiffany. Tiffany pretended not to see. I'll tell you more in a minute, Mrs. Henry said. Just sit still until we each have a name. She started up and down the aisles. Amelia, Katie's best friend, smiled at Katie. I love secrets. Amelia whispered. Me, too. Katie whispered back. Each person picked a name. When it was Katie's turn, she shuffled all the little slips around. She smiled up at Mrs. Henry. Mrs. Henry smiled back. Katie picked a little folded piece of paper. She held it in her hand while Mrs. Henry went down the aisle. She wondered whose name she had picked. And then she had a really bad thought. What she had picked Tiffany? What if she had to be a secret Santa to perfectly mean Tiffany? Very carefully, Katie unfolded one end of her paper. She looked all around her. No one was looking. Katie slid the paper under her desk. She laid it on her knee. She unfolded it until it was flat. She bent to peek at it. Mrs. Henry! Tiffany called out. Katie's peeking. I am not, Katie said. She crumpled up the paper. She could feel her ears get hot. That's enough, Katie and Tiffany, Mrs. Henry said. She didn't turn to look at them. Katie turned to Tiffany. She made her best witch face. Santa saw that. Tiffany whispered. So? Katie whispered back. You said. There is no Santa. Tiffany shrugged. She smiled, a mean smile. Maybe there isn't, she said. But maybe there is.